love you.
A new world order. Order.
Hello, friend. The Mystical American Patriots Society is transmitting to you from beneath 4 million cubic feet of solid granite, in the burning heart of the Yellowstone caldera. This is a variety program for normal sandwich-eating Americans with some concerns about living in a deranged, post-Christian technocracy. So, keep your third eye on the sky and your ear to the ground, as Sumo and Smokestack connect your main brain vein to a higher plane. Are you ready? Stand by.
Has meme magic gone too far? Has meme magic gone too far?
I mean, it may have.
Has it gone too far? Good morning, Giant Meteor 2020. Giant Meteor 2020. Good morning.
Did that get memed into reality?
Well, yeah, I don't know if you remember, but like there was like, you remember when there was the Democratic primaries and everyone realized that they were all like semi-autonomous zombie corpses bent on their own destruction and everyone else's, and no one liked them.
The Democrat primaries candidates?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Remember when everyone hated them? Like everyone on every side because it was all ridiculous. There was like 70 of them.
Mm-hmm.
And one was one was a clearly white woman claiming to be a Native American.
Yeah, I remember her.
And one was a bald black man that everyone knows was gay.
Mm-hmm.
And the other was a rapidly balding white man who was combing it over very quickly, who was confirmed gay, who was trying to appeal to inner city blacks, and because he was a mayor.
Right. Yes.
There was that one.
That fellow.
Then there was the police officer lady, who's now the vice president pick.
Mm-hmm.
Kamala. Which, by the way, that just shows you how much it's all kayfabe. Because, like, if you were serious in the debates with Kamala, what you would do is when she started talking, you just go, cop. 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 Every time she opened her mouth, it's cop. Like, that's all you have to do.
Yeah.
You know, but no one unleashes, see, it's the fake punches.
Mm-hmm.
No, or like you go, oh wait, your actual grandfather owned slaves, like not someone like a long time ago,
right.
But like the guy that,
right,
like you're a literal slave owner and a cop, and that's all you'd have to do. And there was that one, and then there was Midwestern white woman, Cloba or whatever.
Klobuchar, she's a real charmer.
Yeah, and then there was, who else? There were so many. There were so many of them.
Yeah.
And they were all just really substandard specimens of the human species.
It was like the most unpleasant rendition of the Muppets Family Christmas you could imagine.
It was. Bring out the holly. The only thing I remember from that movie is that song and that they were always slipping on the icy patch.
Yeah, you got to watch out for the icy patch.
You got to watch out for the icy patch. But anyway, so people were disgusted with what America had offered unto them as an alternative to Trump. And there were all these memes going around, and a few in real life. I saw real bumper stickers and yard signs that said, "We elect Giant Meteor 2020." With a little thing under it that said, ended already.
I remember those.
Right?
Yeah.
But what if it was like all the cosmic eye was upon that? It was like, okay, well, it's their vote.
Mm-hmm.
Because it looks like you may just be getting what you're voting for. Maybe.
Well, a science man, Tyson, said that there's a meteor coming. And then Pat Robertson said that God told him that there was a meteor coming. But I think it was supposed to happen the day after the debate. So,
well, Neil Tyson said it's going to hit. If it hits, it would hit like the day before the election.
Okay.
Which that would be pretty good timing. Like, oh, you voted for a meteor? Here you go, right on election day. And but Pat Robertson said this was on two things on the Hill. There were two articles side by side, and Neil deGrasse Tyson was like, "Look, there's a small chance a meteor could impact the Earth on the day before election." And then the other one, the headline was Pat Robertson said God told him Trump would win, and then a meteor would hit the Earth.
Oh, is that what it was? Okay.
Yeah, but Pat's I looked into that, and the headline is misleading, as all headlines are misleading.
Sure.
Because he said his actual quote was that God told him that Trump would win, and then not more than 5 years later, or not less than 5 years later, a meteor would hit the Earth.
Okay.
Which if the first part comes true, if Trump does win, then the other half of his prophecy is basically guaranteed to happen. Because he just said, basically he said from the point of 5 years from now to infinity future. Because he said not less than 5 years, which means that it's 5 years to infinity more, there will be a meteor.
Not less than 5 years.
Right, that's what he says technically. So that's the way you become, that's the way you make money at prophecy, by the way. You make these big things, but you do it, you phrase it in such a way that you're sort of guaranteed to be right. Like, I foresee war coming in the future. It's like, well, that's probably true if you just leave future open-ended, you know? But yeah, but apparently there's a small chance. They say less than 1%, but that's still, you know, it's not bad.
Yeah.
Like 1 out of 100 chance to get hit by a meteor is not great.
It's the
More than
size
your
of
chance
like
to die to COVID.
size of a large building or something. I was reading.
I think it's a car. I hear different. See, this is the thing. Every time you look these stuff up, there's different sizes.
Okay, so if it does hit, it's not going to be a huge deal.
Well, it could still be a big deal because those things come fast.
Right. Okay.
Like it depends on where it hits. If it hits the middle of the ocean, probably not that bad.
Okay.
Maybe a little tidal wave. If it hits, say, I don't know, Kansas City, it still wouldn't be that bad. If it hits somewhere where like actual people live,
Right.
where human beings, then it would be a problem. You know, I don't know. Have you ever been? You know, meteors. I just sort of always walk around in sort of every day. I'm like, I just look up at the sky and think it's just any minute now. Just any minute. I just always feel like it's just about to happen, even though it hasn't.
I don't know that that's a healthy
while.
frame of mind to be in all the time.
I don't know. You know, I don't know about Robertson's prophecy record, but I do feel like. Have you ever been to Mile Wide Crater in Arizona? Well, it's what the name sounds like. It's a crater that's about a mile wide. I think it's actually like 0.8 or something, but it's close. And it's out in the desert there above Flagstaff. And it may be the reason the Mojave is a desert. But you walk out there and you can stand on the edge, and it's intense. I mean, it's like you sit on the edge of this giant bowl-shaped hole in the ground, and you think it's just one of those things you go, well, if this happens, there's nothing to be done about it.
Yeah.
It's like if this is coming down on you, there's no prep you can do. There's no like. I guess the closest thing you could do is figure out where it was going to land and get on the opposite side of the earth. And that'd be your best prepping, is to just move to the opposite side of the earth, and that would be the best. That would be because it's like this giant just out there in the middle of the desert. And it's not called mile wide crater. It's colloquially called that. I think it's like accepted name in the scientific community is meteor crater.
Okay.
But I felt that was not very original.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently it's because the town was settled. There was a little settlement there, and they named themselves Meteor after this crater. And then the U.S. Geological Survey or place, whoever has the names of that sort of thing, they recognize the names of geological features by the nearest post office.
Okay.
That's how there was a post office that called itself Meteor before they got up there to name it, and they were like, well, I guess we'll just call this crater Meteor Crater, which is sort of like every crater. That's not very helpful.
Mm.
You know.
Well, you got to follow the flow chart.
Yeah, I mean, so on one hand, it seems like science fiction but on the other hand, it's like clearly on a long enough time scale, we're going to get hit by some awful meteor again. Probably, certainly, what ended the last ice age.
What about the Yellowstone caldera? I mean, I think about that a lot, being that I'm transmitting to you from
inside it.
Inside it, yeah.
Well, are you asking about its likelihood to explode, or its likelihood to be triggered to explode by a meteor impact?
Really either, but I was reading about the correlation between volcanic activity and low sunspot count / increased cosmic rays hitting the Earth.
Well, I think that you have a right to be worried.
Mm.
I think that it's just in the cosmic drama, it would make sense if there was a big cataclysm here towards the end of the year.
Yeah.
It would just make sense. Just like Trump had to get COVID,
mm-hmm.
There has to be some big kaboom. Maybe that comes from above. Maybe it comes from below.
Okay.
I don't know. And people are so resistive to the idea that they're going to get killed from fire from heaven or fire from the ground, honestly. They really, both of those things, they're like, nah. But, like I said, it's probably almost certainly what ended the last ice age.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's almost fully confirmed at this point. You could have really called it like 40, 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. Because there's just no way to account for how the glaciers melted from Canada without it. Because the reason the Great Lakes are there is they're glacier puddles. They're what's left.
Okay.
And the glacier went from covered basically the North Pole all the way down to South Dakota. Mm-hmm. Just covered in ice. It was 1.5 miles thick of ice in some places. And so if you pretend that the climate 10,000 years ago was the same as it is now, even if it warmed in the spring and cooled in the winter like it does now, it would have taken 100, 200,000 years for that to melt away.
Okay.
But it's all gone and been gone for a while. And it appears from the record to have gone away pretty rapidly. And the only thing you can do to that is some big heat injection. Mm-hmm. But a lot of people everyone's against the idea of fire from heaven killing them. The scientific secular community was against it for a long time. They were all against cataclysms and everything had to be slow. The transformation of the earth had to be slow. The Grand Canyon had to take millions of years. It takes 600,000 years for a mosquito to get an extra little burr on its foot or whatever. Everything had to be slow because the prevailing Occam's razor basically means whatever is boring is what we think is most likely. Have you ever noticed that? That's what it nothing in history we explain history there can't be great man theory of history. It's just vague socio-economic forces that are inevitable.
Right.
And the emergence of life has to be this long, boring, slow process. And even sexy things like being mentally insane is just it's just chemical imbalances.
Right.
Everything is just the most likely explanation is whatever won't get your heart rate up. That's just what we deem as there. And also there was that, and also because it's like, if you talk about like a worldwide cataclysm, then you bring in the specter of Noah's flood again.
Can't have that.
Yeah, and then religious people didn't want it either because they want fire from heaven that destroys Sodom and Gomorrah and at the end of the world to also be... I mean, they also want it to be like supernatural fire and not like a physically explainable fire. Which I get, but, it could be either.
And there's not necessarily a difference.
And yeah, exactly. But if you say like, oh, the Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed by meteor impacts... They're like, no, it was like, I don't know, some sort of like fire hose from the sky. Mm-hmm. But people have always just been like against this, even today. But imagine the self-awareness, or the lack of self-awareness. If you're going out to give a talk about how catastrophic geological events play a very small role in Earth's history, and you're doing that. You're going out to give that talk at night, and you're doing it outside beneath the moon. Like literally standing beneath a thing in the sky covered in craters.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, that can't happen. And that's right above your head is this moon pockmarked with these giant craters. And it's like, obviously, that's a thing that is going to be a problem. So, yeah, I think that we're due for a meteor impact. I wouldn't be surprised. And I'm telling all of our listeners now to prepare by really not preparing, because as I said, there's nothing you can do.
It's going to be a miracle if we get through the show.
Well, mentally prepare yourself. You can go to Mile Wide Crater and just stare at it and be like, "Whoa, we are screwed." If something like that comes down. There's one documented case of a woman being struck by a meteorite. She's the only person.
What happened to her?
She was sitting at home I think she was actually living in a trailer park. Mm-hmm. Like, it wasn't that long ago. It was like 100-something years ago. And she was in a really ramshackle shack. She was like listening to the radio or something. Just sitting there with her legs propped up on a stool. And a little tiny meteor about the size of a quarter just flew through her roof and hit her leg and broke her leg.
Whoa.
Yeah, which you got to think like, oh, well, God's just mad at you.
So I guess it was going fast enough to where it could go through the roof and then break her leg.
Yeah, she was just sitting there and she was like, pow! Ah! And then she looked on the ground and there's this thing and a little hole in her roof. And she goes to the hospital and brings the thing. And they're like, she's like, this hit me in the leg. And they were able to save her leg, but they took it and they're like, this is a little tiny meteor. And
awesome.
Imagine that lack of luck. And again, there's nothing you could do about it because you're just sitting there and then God throws a rock at you from the sky. It's like, pow!
What did you do, lady?
I know. You think forever you were like, man, what did I do? Because the odds of that happening are so small. And it just happens to you. And there was one other, I think a dog in Egypt got clocked in the head by one in the same way.
Okay.
That was earlier though. So there was a dog and a lady. So far the casualties in the past 200 years have been 2. Dog and a lady.
So there's just
but they make up for it.
Bullets.
Yeah, but meteors make up for it in volume when they hit. Mm-hmm. Their low casualty count. But there's nothing you can do about it. But I do feel like I feel like I'm not an end times person. I mean, I believe in the end times, but I've never been one to be like prophesying when it's going to happen. Mm-hmm. Like sometime it's going to happen, but when? But I do sort of feel like Terence McKenna's time wave was fundamentally correct. He ain't wrong. Because 2012 has come and gone. And, he's the one that started that.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, well, he did. He was this. So he had this idea, which I think is correct, which he said, look, time is speeding up. And he would say, like, which lasts longer, 1,000,000 years in which nothing happens or 10 seconds with 50,000 events crammed in? Because if you think about the history of the universe as we sort of understand it today, with a lot of asterisks and like qualifiers. First, like 200 million years of the universe basically is nothing, just a plasma. Just like a plasma of electrons, without even any really atoms. And then the next really long aeon, they sort of form into atoms, and after that they form molecules, and then, blah, the universe and stars, and then... But his point was, each successive stage of development of complexity goes faster than the last.
Okay.
Right? So you have the just diffuse gas of plasma takes forever, and then in a much shorter time, but still forever, you get atoms, and then, and then life explodes on the planet, and then life, evolves very rapidly, and then you get to human beings and the advent of speech and epigenetic changes, which take place on top of genetic changes, because now we're able to have cultural and religious beliefs and all this stuff on top of that. And then technological changes, and then those go faster and faster, and then industrial changes, and now we're on the verge of like merging ourselves with machines and computers, and the changes will go faster. And so he felt that that the universe was a novelty generation machine that would create new and new stuff all the time. I mean, we even sort of talk about this now, like, though that was 4 months ago, which I know is 20 years on the internet. People say stuff like that, Time is speeding up. Or technology, like 3 years in the tech world is a long time. Like, things change so rapidly. And in our social space, things are changing so rapidly. Change is so rapid now when you think about it. We've gotten rid of distance. We just say, oh, it's 2 hours away, rather than like in old times you'd be like, oh, it's, 80 miles. But now you just say, you give it even distance by time, because it's just going so quickly. But so today I want to talk about how to surf the time wave.
Cool.
But before I do that, I want to talk about the underbellies of the world.
The underbellies.
Well,
before we do that, I want to tell you about my possible UFO sighting.
Oh yeah, you had a UFO sighting. Which
Maybe.
People are going to be like, no, you didn't. What are the odds that the UFO hosts saw a UFO tonight just before the show, just to give them material for the show?
That's true.
I mean,
well, I'd be happy for somebody to explain this away. It was not. Let me temper your expectations. This was not a big dramatic thing. It was more visual information does not compute. Okay, so I'm sitting on my back deck.
Hold on,
a nice view of the sky.
Can I give you your first UFO story first?
Which one is my first?
Well, so this is what got us really started on this show, is that I would text you my wild ravings, and you'd be like, I don't know, man. Then I'd say, you're going to see you're going to see a UFO one day. I don't know when, but one day.
Yeah.
And then you texted me and said, the sky turned orange, and I went outside to look, and there was a UFO, and then when I went in to get my camera, and I came back out, and it was gone. And I said, see? And that's
I said the sky turned orange?
Yeah, you said the sky turned orange.
Weird.
Had this orange hue. And then you went inside to get your camera, and then I texted back, see, in all caps, which is like, of course. And then we started the show. But so then you had a new one.
I had a new one last night.
Which is this may be an artifact of his brain being an artificial cloning thing, misfiring. And he's beginning to break down like my previous clones. And you will soon turn into a pile of gore. I don't know. I hope not. But let's see.
Well, I'm happy for somebody to explain this away. I just haven't been able to do it since last night. So, I'm sitting on the back porch watching airplanes fly over. Got a nice clear sky. The sun is already set, but the high altitude aircraft are still in direct sunlight, so they are illuminated brightly against the dimming sky. And then lower altitude aircraft, the sun has set on them, and so you can see them in a little bit better detail because they're not gleaming so brightly.
Right.
And they're low enough you can hear them pass over. And so I'm observing these aircraft going at different heights, and then something comes into view that. It's not illuminated by the sun.
Okay.
It's a very strange color. It's like a sand color. Okay. it's not shaped like an airplane. And it's moving a little too slow to be at the altitude that it appears to be. So if it were moving at that relative observable speed across the sky, I would expect it to be a lot higher.
Right.
Being a lot further away and higher up in the sky. And I would expect it to be illuminated. So at the height that it appeared to be flying, it was going too slow for a normal aircraft.
Right.
And it was not shaped like one. It's sort of... I mean, you could maybe say it was a V2 Osprey or whatever those are called with the tilt rotor aircraft. But it was completely silent. It made no noise. Unlike all the other aircraft that were passing over in an altitude low enough to not be illuminated by direct sunlight. And it just passed across my view and into the trees, and I silently and slowly, and I don't know what it was. It was a funny shape.
What?
I couldn't really discern a nose and tail and wings. But it had appendages.
It had appendages? Sort
of. I mean, like maybe this was a wing or this was a, it wasn't exactly clear to me what I was looking at.
Right.
And it was a weird color. It was not traditional airplane color.
Could it have been a strange drone?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, okay. So, but for it to appear as large as it was, I would have had to have heard some sort of propulsion system.
Right.
If it were a drone.
Right.
But it was completely silent. It did not appear to be very far away at all. And I know it wasn't because if it were that high, it would have been illuminated by the sun.
Right. How high up would you say it was?
Oh man, I can't judge those distances very well.
Right, because of the lack of depth perception from the cloning process.
Right. Yeah, but I mean less than 1,000 feet.
Okay. Yeah.
It was weird.
I don't know.
So maybe listeners, if you have an idea, fire it to us.
Well,
mapsoc.org.
Well, in the olden days, everything was blamed on. First, everything was blamed on weather balloons. Like if you said that was a weather balloon, and then toward like the 80s and 90s, I'm not sure why, because I don't think anyone ever did this. They blamed it on Chinese lanterns. They're like, it was a Chinese lantern.
Like we do all the time.
People just do that all the time. Right? Yeah. And then now it's drones. Everything's a drone. And so you just whatever is the spurious thing that people rarely put in the sky, you just say, oh, it was that.
Yeah.
And that's how you get around having to deal with anything, even though sometimes the sky turns orange. Which, I'm not surprised you don't remember saying that because of the cloning processes.
Well, I remember seeing the orb.
Yeah.
That I told you about, but I don't remember saying the sky turned orange, and that's kind of weirding me out. That I don't. I can send you the
text. I'll have to pull them up.
Okay.
Like the sky turned, and that because see that when you said that, I said because another famous UFO man, Mike Cleland, who I mentioned early on, who wrote the book The Messengers about his UFOs and owls.
Yeah,
the owl guy. His first UFO sighting, the sky turned orange for him too.
Oh.
So that's a thing. It's a thing that happens. I'm not sure what that means. But it's a thing. But yeah, UFO. If you have a UFO sighting, write in and tell us about it. And then report it to your local MUFON. Did you report it to MUFON like a good citizen?
No, I did not.
See.
It seemed so low grade, I didn't really want to bother anybody.
Okay, well, that's fair. That's fair. Maybe save MUFON for like if you actually have a close encounter.
Yeah, this was a very distant encounter.
Yeah, but anyway, as I was going to say, before we talk about surfing the time wave and how to survive the time wave as it crescendos into the Eros and the eschaton.
Okay.
We're going to, because it's when the wave crashes over into the eschaton, it's going to be very intense.
Okay.
And you got to surf in that tunnel, But someone asked me, they said, you talk on the show about how science has this like underbelly of mysticism /occultism /dream time. you know? And they said, is that really so? Because, because everyone's taught like, oh, science, you go very professional. You put on your white coat and you go into the lab. You do an experiment and you put in an Excel spreadsheet and then you make a trend graph and you say, aha, and you publish it in a paper. And then you get, this is very sort of organized thing, which is not, anyone that does that has never contributed anything good to science.
I absolutely believe that.
None of that has ever been useful.
And I'll say, I don't think I've said this on the show before, but I've invented several now commercialized, admittedly pedestrian technologies.
Right, but they're still invented.
But nonetheless novel.
Yeah.
And none of them came about by systematized scientific process as it's presented to us in school.
Yeah, like you have actual commercial products that you've invented that people use in the world. They're not, they're not artificial intelligent drone robots.
No one will be really particularly impressed if they knew what they were.
Right.
But they were still...
Right, you still had to come up with
scientific inventions.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like, it doesn't work like that. That's the Reddit idea of how science happens.
Right.
And Reddit's dumb. So I was going to tell you about, because they were like, I was like, not only is there like a philosophical underbelly of science, of like darkness and mysticism, but there's often a very literal one. And I was going to share with you my journey into the literal underbelly of science.
Sweet.
So this happened when I did an internship in college at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. And while we were there, they had a stay in the dorms at Caltech because the regular students were out for summer. Right? And so they just housed us there. And the thing about the Caltech dorms is they took the, because they were in the hippie milieu when the hippies began. Because they were out in California. And they never let it go. And so these dorms were very unique, I would say. Like, first of all, there were no gendered bathrooms or showers. There were individual stalls, right?
Yeah.
But every stall was individual, but there was no like men's bathroom and women's bathroom. It was just everyone used the same group of things, which was weird. There was no, and like the only thing you really had is like your own individual space was your room, which was fairly small. And even that was porous, as I discovered when I woke up one night and saw another student staring at me from the ceiling because he'd pried open the little tile because he was crawling around up there. And I said, "What are you doing?" And then he slammed it back, and then he disappeared into the crawl space. And they also had a rule where basically the students there could do whatever they wanted short of murder. And when I say that, I do mean whatever you wanted. Like, one day I got back from the lab to discover that because there were kids taking summer classes there, so there were still some normal students there, but there were also intern students there. And like there were it was an old style dormitory where like the dorms were arranged in squares with a courtyard in the middle, sort of like in the old world, right? Yeah. And so imagine a big square with 4 equally sized squares within it. And all the outlines of these squares, so you have like a big square and then 2 crossbars of rooms. But you have 4 courtyards, right?
Okay.
So I get back and I come back and they've lined the courtyard to a level of 5 feet on every side with garbage bags. And they have duct taped them all together and filled the courtyard with water to make a 5-foot swimming pool. And they are recreating Greek naval battles in it using little floaty rafts.
Awesome.
It was great, but it was also insane. There were palm trees in some of the courtyards, and they had devised slingshots out of them for people, where you would like slingshot up and bungee down, because they were very smart kids. going to Caltech. There was a mechanical elephant that 4 people could sit in and pedal bicycles, and the elephant would walk with you in it if you all pedaled at the same time. And there was just a lot of strange stuff. There was one kid had cemented his door shut and only exited via the window via a ladder. And this wasn't a problem with the administration.
Right.
Like in most colleges, if you cement your door closed, you're going to get an email or something. Right? But that never happened. So there's all this stuff going on, and I was going to the lab, and then I'd come back to the apartment in the evening, back to the dorm, and I was, just whatever. And I was like, this is all strange. I mean, it was interesting. I'd just walk around at night and just see what people were doing. Because they were always doing something weird. Mm-hmm. And, so anyway, one night again, we hadn't had a chance to get really food or dinner that day. So I was hungry, and I had a little bit of, I think I had one of those hamburger helpers. Okay. And I was going to go to the dorm kitchen to make some hamburger helper, right? And everything, again, was communal, except for my hamburger helper. So I'm looking for pots and pans, and there's some in the sink that have not been washed. So I look around for some that have been. And I open the cabinet drawer, like down the bottom, beneath the sink, right? Or to the side of the sink. And I see some pots, and I reach back to the back to get a suitably sized pot. And when I do, and I grab it and pull it out, I notice that the back panel of the cabinet sort of wobbles. And I say, that's weird. And I touch it again, and it wobbles. So I take everything out, and then I pull on it, and it just comes off. And I look, and there is behind it a secret passage with a ladder going into the ground.
You're kidding
No,
me.
I'm 100% serious. I know this sounds weird. But I said, there is a secret passage here. Because the students, like the guy crawling around in my crawl space, they also didn't mind if you created secret passages. Because they had adopted the idea of the 60s and 70s, which was that intellectual creativity needs to be absolutely free. Mm-hmm. So just do whatever. And then apparently what they would do is they'd do whatever, and then if there was any structural damage, they'd come in at the end of the year and fix it. Was the idea.
Okay.
But, so, I know this sounds fantastical, but this is 100% true. So I noticed there's a ladder in the back of the cabinet. Right?
All right.
And so then I don't worry about the hamburger helper for a while. I leave it on the kitchen counter. Mm-hmm. And I enter the cabinet. And I crawl down the ladder.
Okay.
And it's about, I don't know, it's a good size. I mean, it's about 20 feet. I don't know.
Whoa. Okay.
And then I enter into this dark space that nonetheless has electricity because there's like some fluorescent bulbs above it that are still sort of meh.
So is this just dug out of the earth, or was this constructed
was under
with
the
brick
ground?
Okay, so you're dirt walls?
No, these are at this point these are normal walls.
Oh, so this has been like professionally constructed.
Yes. So, but there's still some fluorescent bulbs just going, but on the floor is like littered with broken glass and broken pottery. And I noticed that I'm in what was at one point an old cafeteria of some kind. Mm-hmm. It's like a large room with tables and chairs that are mostly busted but flipped over. And you can see like where there was at one point like a serving bar.
Okay.
Right. So at one point in Caltech's history, this had been like a dorm eatery on like a basement level.
Okay.
That had now been abandoned.
And they just closed it off. Okay.
Right. That had now been abandoned. And then some kid had figured out a way down there and attached a ladder in a secret passage.
Okay.
So I said, this is interesting. And I start walking around and I notice that this goes for a long way. So I go back up the ladder. I go back to my room. I still forget my hamburger helper. I leave it on the thing. I get a flashlight and I go back down. And what I discovered was that there is a system of tunnels beneath the entirety of Caltech and most of Pasadena, which could be accessed from this dormitory. And so it's called, I learned from other people down there that they called it the steam tunnels. And the steam tunnels allowed you to have access to anywhere on the campus after hours, even if it was locked.
Awesome.
And so you would run around, when I say tunnels, I mean like tunnels. I mean like not quite sewer, like it wasn't wet, but everything other than it being wet was sewer-like.
Okay, so it was like concrete pipe.
Yeah, but it was big enough to stand up in.
Okay.
I mean, I didn't have to crawl in most places. There were a few places I had to crawl, and it was like there was a lot of, it would connect to a lot of abandoned places in the campus that they no longer used, and like old bomb shelters. And you could go in, and then there'd be like other ladders or little like crawl spaces, and you could crawl up, and you could basically move a tile of the floor or something, and come up in a janitor's closet, and then you walk out and you'd be in this lab that had stickers on the side of it that said biological hazards or whatever, and it was locked, and you weren't supposed to be in there.
I need you to take me here.
I don't know if I could get in as not a student, but it was. And then you would go back down and you put the tile back over, and then you would walk over. You crawl. I mean, I didn't have a map. Other kids had explored it enough. They had a map. And you would go around and you could get inside of the civic center, and you could get inside of the thing that passes for a church there on campus, and you could get inside of the astronomy lab, and you basically get in any building there. And there were a couple of them that winded off away from the main campus and sort of, I guess, into the city at large. But those got sort of dark, and I didn't want to go down them because there were sounds of like vagrants.
Ooh.
That lived down there, right? And so
mole people.
Yeah, and there were a lot of Caltech, well, not a lot, but there was a certain brand of Caltech kid that sort of lived down there and would only emerge to go to class, I guess. And there were like little parts of it where you would, I remember one, I turned a corner and there was this little upper bit that had been sort of knocked out of the concrete, and you could just crawl into the dirt under the streets, you know? And I looked up there, and there was like a little skull and like some little bones in a circle where someone had been doing some rituals.
Like what organism's skull did you find?
Not human.
Okay.
But they were straight. I mean, I for all I know, he got them from the biology lab. So there were some weird bones. They were animal bones of some description.
Okay. And
there were like all these weird diagrams on the wall that were like the writings of someone's acid trip and whatever. And then I came up, and there was one, and there was one building which some other students lived in that was like away, and they had turned this one into this dormitory, which was not attached to the one I was staying in, into a sort of physical representation of heaven and hell. Because you would go in and you climb up. I mean, you could also access it from the street level because this was still a functional building. But if you accessed it from the steam tunnel room, all the walls that you emerged upon had been painted with fire and like demons. And they'd replaced all the bulbs with red lights. And there were like pentagrams on the wall. And if you kept going, if you went up to the next level was like that too. But if you went up to the ground level, everything was painted like it was earth scenes, like pastures and animals and sunlight and trees. And the next level was like that too. And the top two levels were like clouds and heavenly scenes. It was very strange. But anyway, you go back down. And I talked to some of the people down in the steam tunnels because I made regular trips down there while I was there because it was fascinating. And some of the kids would be like, oh yeah, well here's the place. They'd be like, here's the place where they first got the idea for the microchip or whatever. I don't remember what it was. You know, and they tell you about like this is the spot where they did all the LSD, and they would put all the stereo systems around them, and they'd synchronize the waves of sound energy on them right in the middle of them on the nexus while they're taking the LSD, and see if they could resonate with the walls, and then they would get the inspiration, you know, and it was stuff like that. And they had all these markers of like where people had come up with some invention on something, like these underground markers, right? Like just maybe on the wall, maybe a little totem of like, here's the place where gene splicing was thought of or something.
Right.
You know, and this was all done, and there were all these ritualistic elements and like talismans on the thing and beads. And it was wild. And you could crawl around there for hours, and as I discovered, you could get into the walls. You could get into there was no real barriers to this thing. And so anyway, after a long night of doing that, I went back up and someone had stolen my Chef Boyardee. And I was sad about that. I didn't even get any dinner. I think I had to eat Ritz crackers.
Mole people.
Well, it wasn't the mole people. I just left it on the counter in the dorm, in the kitchen.
Yeah, it was appropriated by the state.
So, that was a literal underbelly. Like, underneath Caltech, in a literal way, is a giant magic space.
Where everybody takes acid and invents technology.
Right. It's a giant acid space.
Or the technology is transmitted to them from beyond.
Right. And that difference in the public facing and the inward facing is so stark that you really have to see it to believe it. And JPL, this is the reason I stopped going into aerospace is because JPL was so boring. Right? Because it was like, that was the place where those people went after, and that was the spot where like you would do things and write in an Excel spreadsheet. Because they were doing very mundane, practical things like, what force of rocketry do we need to get this exact arc across the sky? And you talk about Excel spreadsheets to an insane level. They had this thing called I don't remember what it was, the X Team or something. They thought they were like X-Men. But you would go there, you would go into this room and you'd say, okay, we're going to plan a hypothetical mission, like putting a satellite around Venus or something. Okay. And they'd say, and you have to and their job was to flesh out the basics of what would be required to do this within like an hour. And they had all these computers, these interconnecting spreadsheets and databases, and they'd enter various values for like mass and fuel and distance, and they'd all argue and say, no, it can't be that, and they type furiously in the next one. And then in an hour, they tell you, here's the basic parameters, more or less. The details we need to work on. You know, but here's like, but like, if you want to do this, here's basically what we're looking at. Okay. You know? And then I remember one of them got real mad at me because I suggested, well, what would you, we talked about a moon rover, and we said, well, why can't we just use some of the, I sort of foolishly said, well, why can't we just use a lot of the same parameters that they use for the Mars rovers, just as a starting point? And he said, oh, because it's a completely different planet. And he said,
angry nerd.
He said, other than being the same, they're completely different. You think you could just, the gravity is different, the soil's different, the atmosphere, everything is different. Which he was right. But
yeah. But didn't have to be so rude about it.
He was so angry. I think he was just angry that interns were wasting his time. Which is fair. But one thing about JPL is everyone there is pretty skinny for scientists because it's on the side of a mountain. And to go to any other building, you have to walk up and down all day. And they're all like average sized people. But then if you go out to like Goldstone or whatever in the desert where they have the big satellite dishes to monitor, like there's this one giant satellite dish that still is in communication with Voyager 2 or whatever that's now beyond the solar system. Right. And it's this giant thing because it needs to pick up this tiny, tiny signal from the edge of space. And they're all giant blimp people because it's completely flat and it's 130 degrees outside every day. So no one wants to move. And that's just what it is. You know, at JPL, like everyone at Goldstone would sit around just being like a giant fat redneck that almost needed a mobility scooter. And people at JPL would they do Tai Chi with the deer. Because there are all these deer. They're like...
At JPL? There's deer everywhere?
Yeah, you'd sit down at the cafeteria and deer would just be like right next to you.
Crazy.
They had domesticated the local deer population. And to their own fault, the local raccoon population, who just sat around like giant squirrels stealing everything. But yeah, so there is a literal underbelly of science. It exists.
Yep.
It exists. I don't know what to tell you. And if
that's a cool story.
See, I'm drinking Gold Peak tea because Sobeys still aren't being made.
This is a disaster. What are you
I don't know.
do?
I tried calling the bottling company and he wouldn't give me a straight answer. He was like, "Sir."
You called?
Yeah, he was like, "Sir, are you one of our custom?" I said, "Are you one of our distributors?" And I said, "Well, not technically, but I am the reason you have like 5 distributors." And he was like, "Sir, I can't. We don't sell directly to customers." Like, I'm not asking you to sell them to me. I'm just asking what's going wrong with your production line, and can I help? And and he was like, "Sir, sir," and I didn't get any answers out of him. But another guy told me they're just behind on everything. There's shortages of everything. So I guess that's just what it has to be. But yeah, always call people. You'd be amazed if you just call people. Like most people will just answer the phone. It's crazy. I've called fairly famous people before. I found their number somehow, and I just called them. Hey, Michio Kaku, I think you're wrong about this. They're like, who? What? Who are you? I'd be like, I'm someone that watched your documentary, and that was really dumb. And then they're like, and then they'll get a little argument with you, like, because their egos are huge, and when someone says, you're
right,
and then then they hang up angrily, but it's still with him. He still follows him. So you just gotta, Anyway, what was I going to say? Oh, surfing the time wave.
Yeah.
Right. We got to surf the time wave. So I was going to do this in the vein of, have you ever read a book called Manthropology or heard of it?
No.
Manthropology was a book written some time ago by somebody. Here we go. Peter McAllister.
Okay.
And it outlines the decline, the physical and mental decline of men throughout the years. Right? And what I would say is that there were a lot of the reason, this book basically explains why we're in the state we're in right now.
Okay.
Because if you look around the world, or especially, let's just keep it on America, but the same is true in large swaths of the globe, right? American men have greatly decreased grip strength than they did even a generation or two ago. We're at the lowest levels of sperm counts in generations. That's probably just because everyone's watching porn all the time, though. And not for,
depleted.
Everyone's like, it's probably plastic in the water or soy in the foods. And it's like, maybe it's just when they test people's sperm counts, it's because they just, ejaculated 3 times that morning. I mean, that's probably what it is, to be honest. Because there's so many,
man.
I mean, I had a friend that used to donate to a sperm bank. And he would say that they asked you to not do any sort of thing for 4 days beforehand.
Okay.
So how many guys go and get tested for these sperm count articles have not watched porn in 4 days? Probably not a lot. Let's be honest.
That's a sad thought.
It's sad, but that's probably why the numbers are skewed, not for a physiological reason. So I'm not that worried about that one. But he points out in this book, he said, there's nothing. He said, not even like, because you think like people console themselves like, well, we're mentally smarter, or, whatever. But he's like, no, he's like in his research, because he's an anthropologist and he studies, he said, there's nothing we can do that ancient men and sometimes women haven't already done better, faster, stronger, and usually smarter. Like, so Mongolian bowmen in the 12th century shot with higher accuracy than modern Olympic archers over distances 6 times greater while galloping on horseback. 6 times greater. And none of your fancy carbon fiber compound bows. Like a wooden bow, you had to pull back with your fingers and not a little clamp thing, and it weighed a lot. It was probably close to a 200-pound bow pull, and they would shoot it, and they would hit extremely accurate. Like, for example, the American military, the American Army, as part of its PT qualifications to get in, you have to prove that you can do 12 miles in 4 hours, which is not hard. That's basically walking. If you walk for 4 hours and without falling over, they're like, all right, we'll take you. The entrance exam to get into the military in one of the Chinese dynasties of about what was the year? I think it was about the year 500. You had to be able to go 56 miles in 4 hours.
Whoa.
Which is essentially running the fastest marathon times you can right now for twice as long. That's just to get in. That didn't even mean you were like it's just like, here's the entrance exam to get into our military, is you have to run modern A-level marathon speeds for twice as long. It's sort of insane. There were Greek athletes in ancient Greece who set long jump and triple jump records unassisted by modern technology, no modern shoes or whatever, no modern training. They stood until the year 1952. And they weren't even really like training. They were like guys that just like, oh yeah, I can jump long. They get there, they didn't really practice. They would do their stuff. They'd fight the war. They'd go tend to their farms. Then once every 4 years, they'd come for the Olympics in Athens, and they'd be like, oh yeah, I can jump real far. And they'd just go.
I thought they trained a bit. They would train a bit. Heraclitus,
But, they weren't like, it wasn't like their career was to be a long jump person.
Right, sure. Okay.
Like, that wasn't like, oh yeah, I do long jump, Here's a great one. So, fastest man on earth at the moment is Usain Bolt. Mm-hmm. Right? It's called Footprint Lake or Footprint Fossil because it's in the Willandra Lakes region of New South Wales in Australia. Mm-hmm. And there are human footprints from about 20,000 years ago that show men running at speeds through mud barefoot that are basically comparable to Usain Bolt. Like if you measure their stride length. Mm-hmm. So he's running barefoot through mud as fast as Usain Bolt runs on a track with shoes. And he's he's not like, as far as we know, unless it's astronomical odds, he's just an average guy of the time.
He's just chasing some critter.
Just a guy chasing a critter. Because, the odds that we would have got the fossil of the fastest man in the world at the time is low. And so out of however many billions of people we have, we're able to get one that almost comes close to him. And he's doing it with shoes and not through the mud. He's just chasing some critter down. He makes a point in this book that people sort of cognize this decline in physicality because it shows up like in movies and stuff. Like we want everything to be super hyper muscular. Yeah. Like he makes a point. He says, G.I. Joes, people talk about girl body dysmorphia with Barbies. But no one talks about guy body dysmorphia with G.I. Joes. Because
we should talk about that.
Because if you took... So, the modern G.I. Joe figure has biceps 3 times as muscular as his 1982 counterpart.
Okay.
3 times as muscular. So the average modern man has a bicep circumference of about 11.5 inches, which is a medical condition. Anything less than 20-inch arms should be considered a medical diagnosis.
I'll have to go measure my arms after
That's
we're
what
done
my
here.
friend. That's my friend, the doctor. He's one of those doctors that wears like cut-off scrubs and like a bandana. You know, one of those guys.
Okay.
And he talks like that guy off Scrubs that also did that.
Okay.
He's just like that guy. And he one time said, he goes, anything less than 20-inch arms is a medical condition. And then he would write you like testosterone replacement therapy pills. So,
Okay.
anyway, but if you scaled up the 1982 G.I. Joe to a living man's height, he would have had biceps just a little bit bigger than the modern average man's biceps. Like the modern person's is about 11.5, and his would have been 12.5. So he was just a more muscular.
Okay.
But if you did the one of today, they would be about 40 to 45 inches, which is nearly physically impossible.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
No, I don't think anyone has ever gotten their biceps that big. They get near 30 with steroids and like it's just physically impossible to have 40-inch arms without injecting your arms with like silicone.
Right.
Which some guys do.
That's
which
messed
is
up.
ridiculous. But yeah, so at the time of this writing in this book, the largest biceps in the world belonged to Greg Valentino, who roided up his body to 28 inches. So he was pushing 30 inches, and he was the largest biceps ever recorded.
Okay.
Even the less hypermasculine figurines like Luke Skywalker or the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers now get up to 28-inch arms if you were to scale them up. So the least muscular figurines for kids have, if you scaled them up to full size, would have arms the size of the largest arms that have ever been recorded. And that's not the most, So a lot of people, he makes the point that like people are really sort of hungering for this hyper muscular masculinity in the same way that they're also sort of hungering for a hyper feminine femininity. You look at like Barbie dolls and stuff, because we're lacking both. And he points out, people are really getting into gyms and steroid use has been off the charts. And even women say that they secretly wish that their boyfriends had larger muscles, even though publicly they're like, muscles are gross, but not really. What they really mean by that is like the giant bodybuilders are gross, which they are. Like the guys that make themselves into freak beasts and just they're like are covered in veins, that's sort of weird.
I don't think any woman has ever complained that their man was a little bit buffer.
Right, exactly. So,
Yeah.
to point out the difference between modern man and ancient man, so there was an Iranian weightlifter named Hussein Rezada, and he slammed down a 508-pound barbell after winning the gold medal in the clean and jerk of the 2004 Olympics. So 508 pounds, clean and jerk. 580, I'm sorry. Really, that's pretty good. Clean and jerk. That's where you take the bar and you sort of straight arm it up over your head. But if you go back 2,600 years, there was archaeological excavations on a Greek island in Thera uncovered a 1,058-pound boulder dating to the 6th century BC that has the inscription written on it, Umastasis, the son of Cribotulus, lifted me from the ground. Which is insane.
Yeah.
A 1,058 pound. Now, granted, that's not a clean and jerk, but it is deadlifting a boulder.
Yeah.
And a boulder is much harder to lift than a barbell.
Right. There's nothing to grip.
Right. I mean, you need a lot more strength. And so 1,058 pounds, the current deadlift record is, I think, just over 1,000 pounds. So that even beats the current one. Right? Mm-hmm. There's also a 315-pound stone from the 6th century BC found at Olympia, which bears another inscription that says, an athlete called Bybon says, Bybon lifted me overhead with one hand and threw me. So 315 lifted over his head and threw it. And I think they said they threw it like so many feet or whatever. No modern weightlifter has been able to lift this stone one-handed. They've tried, or throw it, except for the old-time German strongman Arthur Saxon, which is a great name. In the 1800s, he was able to lift it up over one hand, but he was not able to throw it.
Wow.
Right. So if you did, he does a hypothetical matchup between the best arm wrestling champions of today and like Neanderthals. And if you go with Neanderthal men, it's not even close. But the best arm wrestlers of today could probably beat, or at least be tied by Neanderthal women. Mm-hmm. But because they have a lot of things going for them. One, they're huge. They're bigger. There are more muscles, but also their bones are a lot thicker, which means your muscle insertion.
Yep.
So if you take the bones of, even more recently, like women on the prairie in Western times, they had bones that are about as thick as a modern man's because they were just impacting all the time, just doing work all the time. And so the bones of these Neanderthal women are just these thick things. Mm-hmm. And so it's conceivable when you like factor in like, you know, the muscle to bone ratio of modern women and so on, that she had an arm that would compare in strength, though maybe not in shape, to this guy. Right. So there's that. And that's actually sort of interesting because the Neanderthals lived up north, and there's something called Robert's Rule, this is an aside. Robert's Rule states that as things get nearer the equators, animals get larger. And as you get toward the equator, they get thinner. And you see this even in people. Like people that live in the Swedish countries, very large. Mm-hmm. And so are deer that live up there, and wolves and polar bears. And as you get down toward the center, you get more like black bears and smaller deer. And you get the guys that live near the Sahara that can run forever that are like stick-thin limbs. Mm-hmm. Because it's all about body heat. If you have you want your surface area to volume ratio to be such that you can retain body heat in the cold. And if you live near the equator where it's hot, you want to get rid of your body heat. So you get larger people as you get colder, and larger animals. So there's all of these, like the Greek rowers, when they talked about the how far they would go in their like war manuals, you know?
Yeah.
They would talk about going these obscene distances, and guys tried to see if they could match it today. And so using modern technology, modern rowboats, the speeds that they would have to go to cover the distances they talk about in their war journals, the modern Olympic rowing teams were only able to keep that up for about 30 minutes. And they would have had to do this sustained for hours and hours and hours. And these are they just row with wooden oars, and they're just shirtless and things, just row for hours and hours and hours. So you really start to get like this. I mean, but it may be, there's the concept of retard strength. You ever heard of retard strength?
No.
Well, it's like in Of Mice and Men. Remember Lenny, and he's really stupid strong? That's a real thing. And that's how chimpanzees are so strong, because chimpanzee muscles are smaller than ours. Well, I mean, they're not, like, a chimpanzee weighs less than we do, right?
Yeah.
But they're up to 4 to 5 times as strong because it could be that they have less intellect. I mean, we know they have less intellect, but that could be the reason. Because humans have a lot of fine motor control, which chimpanzees lack, and also retards lack. And that allows you to do great things like very small work and actually to throw a spear or a ball very accurately. Like chimpanzees can throw poop and rocks, but they very rarely hit anything. Because because that requires, but people can fire, people have the best arm in the animal kingdom. I mean, we can hurl things and hit targets, which is probably one of the advantages that fine motor control brings, even if it brings a lack of raw strength, right? But chimpanzees, they just sort of, when they contract their arm, they sort of fire all the muscle fibers at one time. Whereas most people, and you could train to do this better, like weightlifting and stuff helps you do that better, and manual labor, but even there are these, on some scenarios, like you hear about women lifting a car off their child or whatever. In some fight or flight scenarios, almost all the muscle fibers fire. But most of the time, unless people are under extreme distress, they don't all fire at once. And we're not quite sure why. They think that's energy conservation and also because you want some level of control over your movement. And if you fire them all, it's sort of spasticky. But the chimpanzees don't have that, nor do they care. They don't care if their movements are spasticky. They just want to rip your face off, which is the same as what retards do. I mean, seriously, the people with, like my wife has done a lot of work in her profession with, and she does not like the word retard. It's not but anyway, she's done a lot of work with people with Down syndrome and extreme autism or whatever. And they are often very strong. Like she worked with a 30-year-old man, her and another lady were working with him. He had autism. He was developmentally in about the years, 8-year-old, but and he was mostly pleasant all the time, but one day he would get mad. Some days he'd get mad and throw a tantrum. And one day he got mad and he's not an overly huge person. He was like he was close to 6 foot tall. But he got angry and he picked up the woman my wife worked with almost over his head and just sort of threw her across the room into the wall. Just sort of like a gorilla. And he doesn't have very fine motor control. And these are probably related. Because there's some level of intellect that's required for controlling the fine muscular fibers in like a concerted effort to do things like write with a pen or throw a spear or like do some small thing with a screwdriver that prohibits you from activating all the muscle fibers at once. This is also why people that are possessed get really strong, because they're just, everything's firing at one time.
Okay.
Right. And that's how people can do these insane feats of strength in moments of distress, is that all of your body is firing at the same time, whereas most of the time that doesn't happen unless you're mentally challenged or a chimpanzee. Right. And so he pointed out as one explanation for this, like these Greek rowers, is that they lived a more physical existence that required a lot less training of like writing and doing fine, delicate tasks, which is what modern people do. Because we do a lot of fine, like typing on a keyboard is a very delicate task. Making little mouse movements is a fine, and all these little fine, working a little screwdriver. And so they thought, well, maybe that sort of mind-body connection required for delicate tasks precludes this sort of mind-body connection for firing all your muscle fibers at one time. And maybe this is why these ancient people could do some of these feats that we find somewhat impossible. The other suggestion is that we have entered a stage of increasing neonoteny. You ever heard that term? No. Neonoteny, it's like neonatal. It's this idea that so some animals can live their whole life in a juvenile state and even reproduce that way. Like there are species of salamander that live in a tadpole stage for 10, 20 generations.
Ooh.
And they reproduce that way because salamanders have tadpoles too, not just frogs. And they'll live in this stage until the environmental conditions shift, like their little pool they're in dries up. And when it does, these tadpoles suddenly discover they have the ability to grow like arms and legs and become a different thing. Right? And they're also, and so one of the markers of neonoteny in apes is hairlessness. It is a larger head to body ratio because the infants have a larger head to body ratio than adults. Lack of musculature, and so all these things sort of, in some way, you could view man as a neonotenous ape that has neonotenous characteristics.
Okay.
And if you keep pushing that forward, where do you get? This is going to blow your mind. Imagine what you get if your brain keeps getting bigger, your eyes keep getting bigger, you get taller but not stronger, you get thinner limbed. What do you begin to look like?
Gray alien.
A gray alien. That's right. Which is this is the strongest point people make for no, they're not aliens, they're humans from the future. They're time travelers. Because what do you do if you just get sickly? Your body decays from lack of need of use. You're doing all these high intellectual tasks, right? And you go into space. What do you need in space? You need big eyes because the light, and a big brain. But then your physical body doesn't matter as much because you live in low gravity. What would human beings turn into given a long enough time?
Yeah.
Right? And that would also make sense for why they need to come back and collect sperm and eggs from people because their reproduction processes have also declined. Right? This makes sense of the abductee thing, but they're always harvesting sexual thing. It just sort of is an interesting tie-in.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
But that also could but maybe that's just maybe all of that is just a psychological, collective unconscious prophecy of where we're headed if we don't change course. And maybe it's watch out. Okay. And that could also be why people are so associated with, so fascinated with Bigfoot, because he's the opposite. Or we could go back. We could return to Momkey. Just go back to monkey. You know, what do you want to do? You want to go forward or you want to go backwards? Because here's what forward looks like. It's these gray aliens, sort of sickly, pale. But they can fly, or you can go back to the big, because guys in the past were often hairier. They were often larger. Like Esau in the Bible. He's a man that's so hairy, his father is confused by a goat skin.
Yeah.
So you imagine that sort of thing.
Well, your example about the salamander made me think about, if we had some EMP or Carrington event, and we're all suddenly forced to live the existence of a medieval peasant farmer all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Would our bodies react to this, and would we turn into would we bulk up?
I think so.
Would we grow more hair? And would I personally, or would my grandchildren be hairier? How fast does this change occur?
That's a good question.
I know if you're outside in the sun all the time, your hormones change.
Right.
It's not, you don't just get a tan. Other things happen too.
Correct.
I just wonder how fast that change would occur and what would it look like.
Yeah. Well, as I thought about this too. I mean, you think of pigs. So pigs are these pink, unhairy things in the farm. But people don't realize that if you let a pig go, within a few months, it grows hair and tusks. So the pig's artificial environment, the artificial environment of the pig, where it doesn't need to fend for itself, creates a state of neonoteny in the pig where it continues to look like a piglet even into adult life. Right? Isn't that weird? And so then when you let it out and it has to fend for itself, it grows tusk, it gets hairy, and it does this in a span of about 5-6 months. Like a feral hog, you can tell the difference between a feral hog and a wild hog, like a born that was, this is to your point, was it you or your grandchildren? A hog born in the wild does look different, but only a little bit.
Okay.
Like the hog that has gone feral, that was a tame hog, looks, unless you have a trained eye, you can't tell the difference. And they get big, by the way.
Yeah, yeah.
I was driving through the countryside the other day, and a boar crossed my car, and I swear, I mean, it could stand near the car and like look in at you. They're large.
They'll get 1,000 pounds.
They're big, scary animals. Another example from this is grasshoppers. What's the difference between a grasshopper and a locust?
I don't know.
A locust is a grasshopper in its gregarious form. That's the term for it. So there's no difference in species between a locust and a grasshopper. A grasshopper is green and he hops around by himself. But if conditions get right, many species, though not all, but many species of grasshopper, if they get in a big group, there's some sort of chemical signal will go through them that they all need to undergo a metamorphosis. And they shed their previous skin and they have a yellow shell instead of a green one, or sort of a brown one sometimes, that is about 50% thicker than their last one, and their fangs grow 50% bigger, and their wingspan gets larger, and they all act in a big group and just and they may not do that for 20, 30 generations because the environmental conditions have not been correct. And so that makes you think, well, how many species can do such things? Or
how many species we don't even know exist because they've been dormant for recent history.
Maybe Bigfoot is just a man that's gone into his gregarious form.
I wondered, we were talking about a little bit about dragons last week. And, there's in the history of the Kings of Britain, there's a passage where Merlin basically digs up some dinosaurs and they hatch and they wake up. Sort of like if you take a paver stone out of your garden and you flip it over and there's a frog sleeping underneath.
Right.
And if you set him in the sun, he'll wake up and probably look for another place to burrow.
Yeah.
Kind of the same deal.
Yeah, but so to your point, like what? So like, it makes you think, like, do human beings have a gregarious form? Maybe they do, and maybe that explains some of these intense feats of strength in the past that also happened in like wartime and stuff.
Yep.
Like, here's a great example. So have you heard about that family in Russia that was living in Siberia unconnected for like 40 years?
Yes.
So there was a family in Russia who fled the Bolshevik Revolution by going into Siberia, which you can debate the wisdom of that because their lifestyle sounded like it was as hard or more. I guess they stayed alive.
Right.
But so anyway, in 1978, Soviet geologists prospecting the wilds of Siberia discovered a family of 6 lost in the taiga, which is the forest there. They were utterly isolated, right? So a helicopter sent to find a safe spot to land for the party of geologists was skimming the tree line near from the Mongolian border when it dropped into a thickly wooded valley. And so it was a spot they said was so thick it was just really hard to find anything. But peering through this, the pilot saw in a clearing 6,000 feet up a mountainside, wedged between a pine and a lark, and scored what looked like long, dark furrows. So he saw basically a little farmland. Like there was this little furrows just out there.
Yeah.
And then they get out and they walk up and there's all these little hints of human habitation, like little clearings, a garden, something that looked like, a walking staff. And they're like some people live out here. So they go back, they get more people and they come up and they eventually, it was 150 miles from the nearest settlement in a spot that had never been explored. The Soviet authorities had no records of anyone ever living there. So they said they were understandably concerned and a little worried because one guy said who did it. He said it's less dangerous to encounter like a bear than it is a wild stranger in the woods.
Yeah,
so he
true.
said I was a little like I don't know. So he said they packed their backpack with like fruits and vegetables, like they were gonna go visit some tribe and some candy, and like we're gonna go try to make friends with these people. And so they were led by a geologist named, and some Russian name, Galina Pisminskaya, who was some guy. So he said, we chose a fine day and put gifts in our packs for our prospective friends. I'm sorry, it was a woman. And said, though, just to be sure, I did check the pistol at my side. Just you know. So as we began going up there, we saw all these things, like we saw a little path, some staffs, a log laid across a stream for them to walk across, and finally a shed filled with birch bark containers of cut up dried potatoes. She said, then they come to this little dwelling, and they sort of get there and knock on it, and he said this guy just sort of opens the door like some sort of person out of a fairy tale. This long beard, scraggly, just sort of looking at them with these, you know, crazy eyes. And he says, in sort of very gnarled Russian, because he hasn't used it in a long time, well, since you're here, you might as well come in for dinner. So they get there, and there are some of his children are there. That he has two daughters, and says they can speak, but not really. Like they speak a Russian that only they have spoken. The children speak a Russian only they have ever spoken with each other, basically. Okay. And so it's like barely it's almost their own language already. Mm-hmm. Like it's like Russian through, and it makes you think like how fast their language could evolve if you were just isolated. In one generation, you're already like almost unintelligible. He said it took them like weeks to where they could begin to understand each other. But anyway, they were out there and they lived a very intense life, you know. And to think about their gregarious form, their son, who I think they named Dmitri because he was Russian, and everyone has to be either Sergei or Dmitri if you're Russian, or maybe Vlad, I guess. But they didn't eat meat for years until the son grew up, and he grew up as a wild man in Siberia, basically. And when he was about 15, he began the practice of barefoot hunting down elks by running at them and catching them, grabbing onto them, wrestling them down, and beating their heads in with a rock.
That is awesome.
That was how they got meat. Is their son would just run after elks, not even deer, elk, which are huge, by the way. Yeah. He'd jump onto them, grab their heads, wrestle them down, and beat their heads in with a rock. And then he would put it on his shoulders and carry it back home, which is an insane feat. Like, that guy is not someone you would want to mess with. But that just took him one generation. Like, I have to grow up in Siberia and live or die here. And I don't have shoes. And, you know, the only thing we have to eat is these potatoes that we're barely growing, or I can go catch that elk. And I'll just do it with my hands.
Just as an aside here, this well-recorded event throws into doubt the entire Neanderthal timeline of man. It does,
because...
And the evolutionary process theory and all that stuff, because all you got to do is take some people, stick them out in the forest, and they turn into giant, thick-boned, super strong, you know, I'm going to wrestle this elk dudes. Yeah. And they're bada bing, bada boom. There's your caveman.
Yeah, well, it's gregarious. It's your gregarious form. Like, it is like, it's like being a pig, and we live in this artificial environment, and you're kept in your juvenile stage. But when you're released into the wild, you grow hair and tusks. I mean, it's very similar. But, you know, this is... Have you ever watched Andrew Uckles? He's in it... Because you sort of say, like, oh, that's not possible. You can't wrestle it. Andrew Uckles is this insane Australian guy who's, I think, in his late 20s now. But in YouTube, in the early 2012... Around 2012, the early 2010s, he sort of got YouTube famous for... And he's not a big man. I mean, he has a lot of foot speed. he has that sort of wiry strength, but he's not like a large man. But and he lives in a house in Sydney, I think. But he spends a lot of his time, like several weeks out of every month, in the outback. And he said he always has. He just loved being outside. And he would make these videos of how to catch animals barehanded. And they're great. Look up Andrew Uckles. It's like almost Uncle without the N.
Okay.
They're fantastic. Especially because he does it as a tutorial, as though you're about to go also do this. He's like, now I tell you here, Chuchi. I'm going to teach you how to catch rabbits using snakes. And he's wandering around the Australian outback picking up these poisonous snakes by the tail. And he's got like 5 of them in his 2 hands, just dangling by his side, like holding them straight armed out. He's like, now you got to be careful with these, because if they bite you, let me tell you something, it's lights out. It's lights out for you. Now what we do here, now I got the snakes, I'm going to put the snakes into the rabbit burrow, you see, into the holes. And then I'm going to plug up the exits except for one. And when the rabbits run out, boom, you got them. You got them with your hand. Because he flushes the rabbits out using snakes, which is, it's a smart idea. He says, I learned this from the Aboriginals. And he does one. He does catch a deer barehanded on camera. It's fantastic. He sits by a watering hole, covers himself with mud, so he blends in. And when the deer comes for a drink, he just goes, "Hi!" and he jumps out, and he disappears from the camera as he and the deer run away. And 5 minutes later, you hear, "Rrr, rrr," and he's just dragging this deer back into the camera by its antlers. He's like, see here. He's like, now the trick is, and like I say, he always tells you as if you're about to go also do this. He's like, the trick is you got to keep your center of gravity low. When you go for him, and then he gets the deer in the thing. He's like, all right, settle, and he begins talking to you. And then he tries to go into Steve Irwin mode or David Attenborough mode. He starts talking to you about the animals and about the species and about the conserving them and stuff. He's like, and we got to do a good job of keeping these animals safe, because as you can see, they're a national treasure. And we go, settle, because then the deer just jumps, again, it gets its energy back, and he's in a wrestling match in the mud. Settle, and you see, that's why. And then he lets it go, And he's like, this is, huge respect to this guy. Because he said, I don't have anything against hunters, but I just felt it was too easy. It's too easy. I wanted to see if I could capture him in my hand. And he does this one, which was maybe his best one. He said, he's walking down the road, and he's like, I'm looking for roadkill of an emu. I'm going to show you guys how to catch a kangaroo. And so he finds this roadkill of an emu, and he picks it up and he says, and he talks about the emu and the emu. He goes into Steve Irwin mode for a second, talking about how we need to conserve the emu. And then he looks at the camera and says, now I'm going to incorporate myself into this emu. And
what?
He basically does a Luke Skywalker thing and hollows out the inside of this emu. And puts the head on a stick so he can have it up above him and twirl it around like he's walking. And then he walks around the outback in the corpse of an emu until he can get close enough to some kangaroos, because they think he's a weird zombie emu. And then he just jumps out and grabs one.
Those things can tear you up. Kangaroos are strong,
I know.
man.
It's running away from him, and he just grabs it by the tail. And it's spinning around. He's like, hold on, mate, hold on. And the whole time the animal's going, because the animal does not like this. He's one of my favorite YouTube. He stopped doing it so much as he got older. I think now he does tours in Australian outbacks, so you can actually go out with him.
Okay.
But it was great. There was one where he was like, I'm going to get this fox, and he goes into a tree stump, and he comes out 4 minutes later with the fox it's attached to him just because it's biting into his arm. That's how he caught it. He just has it attached to his arm by teeth. And he's pulling it out say, hey, go, and he's screaming. But so you can do this. It is humanly possible. We have it on video of people. He didn't catch an elk, to be fair, but it was a large antlered deer. And he caught it, and he's not a large man, and he caught it and barehanded. And, so it is possible to do.
Okay, so this has all been very fascinating, but what does it have to do with the time wave?
Oh, yeah, the time wave. I guess we are running long. No, we're not.
Maybe this is a two-parter.
No, we're not.
We
it's
are.
only an hour and 30-something minutes.
I've got to go kill chickens with listener two-stroke today, so we can't go for 2.5 hours.
Okay. I'm
going to be
late. I'm
late.
going to quickly go through the rest of it.
Okay.
So there's also evidence that people used to, in ancient times, they would fight. Like, people wonder, like, how you would deal with lions and stuff when you didn't have, and hyenas.
Sure.
There's some evidence that they just punched them to death.
Yeah.
There's some evidence they just punched him. We've recorded one of our heavyweight champion boxers has he was in the 1950s, Rocky Marciano. Some engineers tested his punching strength, and he was able to lift a 1,100 pound weight 12 inches off the ground using his punch.
Okay.
That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, that's
there's some
serious.
evidence, and you look at like the hand sizes of the bones of some skeletons from it. There's some evidence that it was possible that if a hyena came up to them, you could just punch them out. Right? Which a lot of guys, let's be honest, cannot punch out hyenas today. You know what I mean?
All right, so if I want to take on my gregarious form, I think it's there's been enough study to prove that you can't necessarily just do it in the weight room.
Right. The weight room helps, but you need some intense life or deathness going on. Like, you need some intense, like, live or die. I have to morph into my gregarious form to live.
So this does make a little, if you think about sort of the stereotype outdoorsman as being muscular and hairy despite never going to the gym, but he's always out in the woods tracking animals and killing them and cutting them up and, that sort of thing. It sort of makes sense. It's like you're kind of spending all that time doing Mortal Kombat with nature. You're kind of reaching into your gregarious form a little bit, whereas, the typical pencil neck city dweller sitting at a computer all day.
Yeah, and if you know about Mouse Utopia.
Yes.
So real quickly, if you don't know about Mouse Utopia, it was an experiment done in the 70s, I think, maybe the 80s. A guy took a bunch of mice, or rats actually, and he gave them a scenario where they had all the food they could ever want. They had no lack of water. They had shelter. He wanted to see what would happen. And within, I think, 10 generations, they all died.
Wow.
And you think, like, well, why would that be? You have everything you need. And it's because in the absence of any external pressures, they began to get psychotic. And I mean, like, they would attack each other. They would observe self-harm, which is something that humans do now. They would bite their own tails. They would injure themselves. Some of the males swore off sex totally. It just became what he called the beautiful ones. All they did every day was eat, and they would groom just incessantly. He said they looked very pretty. They're very clean. Yeah. But they sort of became metrosexuals. He said there was a rise in homosexuality behavior in the rats. There was a lot of the women took on very masculine traits. They would when they had children, they would eat them, even though there was no reason to do so if they had sex at all.
This is just sounding very uncomfortably.
I know, and
modern world.
and you think like. See, this is what I say, the spiritual and the physical, they're two sides of the same coin. And when you live in an artificial environment, it throws off your endocrine system. Like, your hormones are not right, which is why a lot of guys like to try and supplement that artificially with testosterone replacements and whatever. And your hormones are so off that like genders get blurred, your behavior gets weird. You start acting strange and really passive, but also aggressive at the same time. Like, you do a lot of self-harm. I mean, I mean, you literally look at Mouse Utopia, and it's like that's what's going on. Or when they did the biodome thing, you remember the biodome experiments? The trees would fall over because they didn't get strong enough to hold themselves up because they found out that the trees needed periodic resistance from the wind in order to build up fibrous strength to stand.
Right.
So when you create this artificial environment, which is what our cities are, people get weak and weird. And they get and not just weak and weird, but they get demented. Mm-hmm. And so our modern problems may just be that we've reached a tipping point of the number of people that live in cities. And it creates this weird, demented environment where your endocrine system's all thrown off, your hormones are all thrown off, your behaviors are all strange, and there's nothing to be done about it. Except, which is the depressing, if the mouse because if this happens in rats, it's like, well, that's a pretty deep problem. That's like a problem on a very fundamental biological level. And there's really nothing to do about it except for wait for them to die, which is very unfortunate. But yeah.
Well, this makes me feel really good about the rest of my day, which is going to be killing and processing chickens out in a field under the beautiful autumn sun.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. But I mean, look up the Mouse Utopia. It is exactly what happens to people. But see, here's the thing: they spin it because they always want to spin it, and they say "Oh, this is why we need population control." But no, because that is an artificial answer to an artificial problem. The rats in nature don't have this problem.
We need population hardening.
Yeah, you've set up this weird condition that messes up the rats. Yeah. Just like people have set up this weird condition that messes up the people. Gotham, in Batman, you know what Gotham means?
Yeah.
Gotham is German for, Gotham, it means goat pen. It's a city of goats. It's like a herd.
Yeah.
It's all these people trapped in their juvenile phase. They're the pink pigs. And they really can't get out. And this is what I mean surfing the time wave. Because, to bring it in so we can finish, so you can do your thing. Even though I have to do it now forced and faster, it's fine.
You want to make it a two-parter?
No, it's fine.
Okay.
The future belongs to those, because the changes it's obvious that the changes the rate of change is increasing. You look at the amount of change that happened from 0 AD to 500 AD, and the amount of change that happened from 500 to 1500, and the amount of change that happened from 1500 to 1800, and the amount of change we're just changing so quickly.
Yeah.
It's every 10 years is a radically socially different, it's economically different, it's technologically different. Within the span of your own lifetime, the end of your life will be a world that will look almost nothing like the beginning. And that is going to swamp a lot of people. And so I think to surf the time wave requires you maintaining your humanity while being also able to live in this world. So you need to be able to, we have to figure out how to assume our gregarious form while also being on 4chan or the internet or whatever it is we're doing. You know what I mean? You have to be able to live in this world,
right,
without letting it turn you into a Mouse Utopia mouse. You have to be able to live in this world without having it just destroy your, and to some extent that's probably getting all of us. Bronze Age Pervert made this point in his book, which is a great point and true, is that chimpanzees in the wild have never been observed to masturbate. But in captivity, they do all the time. And you think about that, and then you look at all the people on pornography today. And it's sort of how much of it is even really their fault? Is it just endocrine system being screwed with, and now they're this is why you can't judge, because you don't know how much people have control over their own actions. Because if mice can turn into transgenders because their environment is all weird,
Yeah.
You know, it's just, but so you got to surf the time wave, you have to become more human, not less. But then this is the trick, and we have to figure that out. And also, a lot of people are probably going to die in the goat pen, which is going to be sad.
Yeah.
But anyway, on that happy note, I need to end every show. It needs to become tradition where we just end every show on, and then everyone dies. And that's,
well, I think that's already a tradition.
I know. It's. I just need to formalize that and make it like, oh yeah. Hey, look, my recording's working still.
Fantastic. Well, hopefully we'll have better sound for your smooth voice.
Yeah. Mouth noise.
So as we close, I just had a thought from the last episode, talking about 5th generation warfare. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, I got to tie COVID into this somehow.
Right. Good.
And I thought about, okay, we're having a supposed new wave in the Rust Belt.
Which is not. No one is. Everyone.
Specifically in Michigan.
Let me.
Okay.
There's
go
no.
ahead.
It's not. This is magical thinking. I go around the country. Everyone is moving everywhere. People are in stores all the time. The highways are now full again. And it's like, if this is, there's no way that it wouldn't be a lot. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. People are in close contact all the time. And their masks are all over their face. Some of them, people are wearing them like an eye patch. Some people, it's around their throat. None of what we're doing is doing anything. Like, either just everyone barricade yourself inside for a month, or don't bother. The halfway measures make everyone look insane. Because it's just not... never mind.
So anyway.
Yeah, go ahead.
So anyway, we're having this Rust Belt new wave of cases supposedly, and here comes the doom. Everybody be afraid in the Rust Belt. Well, the Rust Belt is critical to the election, specifically for the Democrats, who have mostly voted by mail and absentee. Mm-hmm. And so a Rust Belt new wave of COVID would keep the Republicans from maybe going to the polls, they think. Mm-hmm. They suspect. And also, what state in the country has come the closest to a populist uprising overthrowing the state government? That would be Michigan.
Yeah.
Where an armed band of populist protesters has at one point marched into and taken over the seat of state government. And the politicians had to run and shelter in place in the interior of the building while men armed with rifles were dancing around and waving flags in the lobby of the government building. And the police didn't do anything. Right,
because it's like when the Ted Bundy guys.
They can't. Here's the thing: if your 5th generation warfare didn't work, there's nothing you can do. Like, they still can't win kinetically against 4th generation warfare.
No, they can't. That's why
they still can't win. And the 5th generation is a stopgap. That's why those guys were able to go and march around the government building in Michigan, and nothing happened. Right. They didn't do anything about it. But their response is, "Oh, we better do this COVID thing to keep everybody chill."
Yes,
I mean, once you realize that's the real situation, that's amazing to think about.
Because it's not real. I don't mean the virus isn't real. I mean, like, it's obviously not as dangerous as we were thinking or told. Or it was and is now, what I think is most likely, because this is what viruses do, is that it was more lethal and has mutated into a less lethal form.
I also
because it is not useful for a parasite to immediately kill its hosts, or to make its hosts so obviously contagious that people stay away from it, because then it doesn't have the chance to spread. So in evolutionary terms, it mutates the mutations of the virus that are less deadly, that allow it to be around more people. Like, this is why the common cold is a successful virus, because it doesn't kill people, and it doesn't make people afraid to get around other people. And so from its own perspective, it's spreading fine. I've got all these hosts. This is great. I don't have to kill them. They just walk. They don't care very much that I'm here, and they sneeze on other people, and it's great. If you make yourself a virus that kills people bad, people stay away, and then you don't have a chance to get more hosts.
Right.
So it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective that the mutations which are less virulent will prevail, and viruses are unstable anyway. So what I think has happened is that originally the virus was bad, and the virus has mutated into something that is not that bad anymore. I mean, it still has, but we're still acting like it's doing what it did at first, and it obviously is not. Because you just kind of look around the world and say, well, why isn't Africa keeling over? Because people in Africa, in the middle of the biggest cities in Nigeria, are not acting like, why isn't, it's just not happening. But people, and so at this point, it's just become a political tool, and everyone's gone insane. But anyway, why can't people really don't have any idea of how science works? They've never traveled into the underbelly of science. We have to go down into the tunnels and look at the totems on the wall and climb into the heaven and hell building and do the little thing with the dinosaur skulls in the closet underneath the Pasadena City. And it's all going to be fine. But when you have a Reddit view of science, you're a retard without retard strength.
Way to tied it all together.
I was just so upset.
This is our longest episode.
Is it?
Hour 51 minutes.
Well, you're welcome.
Yes, I am
You're welcome, listener. Don't sit there and be like, oh, this episode is so long. It's so long. Look.
It was chock full of rich content.
Without this, you will be swamped by the wave of the time wave, and you will become a transgender rat in a little maze without any retard strength, thinking that you have COVID.
A little appreciation. Just send us a nice
appreciation.
Note when you achieve your gregarious form.
You non-hairy apes. All of our listeners are pink pigs.